My name is Will, and I'm partner with Lacey, and our topic is the pro-abolition of the death penalty. Before we got into that, I thought I would give a little bit of background on what the death penalty is so we all know what we are talking about. So, the death penalty has been around since the beginning of recorded history, with King Hammurabi of Babylon in the 18th century BCE, and he put forward the Code of Hammurabi, if you've heard of it, and that's what's called positive law, and he set forth about 25 different crimes that were all punishable by death. Then going to the colonial period in 1608, it was first recorded that Captain George Kendall was sentenced to death for the charge of spying for Spain. Going to the Revolutionary era, in 1779, Thomas Jefferson wanted to revise the Virginia death penalty down to murder and treason only. And then during the 19th century, there was a lot of back and forth with states abolishing and then reinstating, or partially abolishing, then totally abolishing the death penalty. But by the end of it, we have 17 states and the District of Columbia that have gotten rid of the death penalty in some form. So the first issue I wanted to talk about was the risk of convicting a person and sentencing them for a crime that they didn't commit. In 1988, Walter McMillan was convicted in a murder trial that was based on some pretty flimsy testimony, but because of that conviction, he ended up spending years on death row, going through a long and complicated appeal process to win his freedom. Another case where the defendant had to fight an appeal process was Herrera versus Collins. Herrera was making the case that a claim of true innocence meant that he should get a writ of habeas corpus, but the court ruled against it and instead put faith in the clemency system. The issue with the clemency system, however, is there's only about 2 of those granted a year. And Herrera himself never got one and was executed about 4 months after the court's decision. These cases, and quite a few like them, started to put a spotlight on the issues with the death penalty and the risk of innocent people languishing on death row and potentially being executed for the crimes they didn't commit. Since 1973, 190 people have been completely exonerated of the crimes that got them a death penalty to begin with. We're also seeing that advancements made in DNA and forensic science are proving the innocence of people, but in some cases it's too little and too late. Along with the risk of innocent people being convicted is the arbitrary application of the death penalty. The penalty should only be used on the worst, but oftentimes we find that it's inflicted on the most vulnerable among us. The death penalty laws vary state to state, but one of the states with the biggest issue in arbitrary applications would be Alabama. This is where Walter McMillan was actually convicted, but the jury only sentenced him to a life imprisonment. It was actually the judge in the case that overruled that sentence and turned it into a death penalty. And this isn't a singular problem either. About 20% of the people in Alabama on death row are there because of this judicial override. Another issue to highlight with arbitrary application is race and how that ties into it. Black Americans make up about 41% of those on death row and 34% of those executed. And it isn't just on the defendant side that we see issues of race pop up, because who the victim is plays a huge role in the severity of the sentence that you get. Because if the victim in the crime is white, you end up being 17 times more likely to get a death penalty than if the victim was black. And the last topic that I'd like to go over are issues with mental disability, age, and mental illness. At least 44 people who would qualify as having an intellectual disability were executed before 2002. That's about 3% of those convicted since 1973. 366 people were executed before those were banned in 2005. And when they were finally banned, 71 people were on death row at that point in time for juvenile crimes, and about 2/3 of them were people of color. And finally, the last issue is mental illness. Experts from Mental Health America estimate that 20% of those on death row have a serious mental illness, once again highlighting how this extreme punishment has been used on a large population of those who are really most vulnerable. I'm now going to go ahead and turn it over to Lacey for her to present her topics on
it. Okay, so I will be doing our third and fourth points. Our third point is that the death penalty does not deter crime effectively. So there's no credible evidence that the death penalty deters crime more effectively than long terms of imprisonment. So basically, states that allow the death penalty do not necessarily have less crime or lower crime rates in those states than the states that don't allow the death penalty. So, for example, the state of Vermont, they do not have the death penalty in effect, and in the year 2021, Vermont had an overall crime rate of 173. And then the state of Tennessee below, they do have the death penalty, and in the year 2021, it had a crime rate of 672. These are both per 100,000 people. So you can see there's quite a difference between the two, one without the death penalty in place and one with death penalty in place. And of course, there are a lot of different factors and other details involved in states and crime rates and all these different things. And there are some states without the death penalty whose crime rates are actually higher than those with, because there are these other factors involved. But I use this example to kind of show that just because a state has the death penalty in place, it doesn't necessarily mean that the death penalty, that state is going to have a lower crime rate. So, and I also think that before you commit a crime, you're not necessarily thinking of the consequence, and you're not necessarily thinking about what's going to happen after that. It's kind of in the heat of the moment and all this kind of stuff. Our fourth and final point is that the death penalty is incompatible with human rights and human dignity. So I made a list of the primary means of execution in the U.S., which involves hanging, electrocution, the gas chamber, a firing squad, and lethal injection. And I don't want to go into too much detail of what each of these is. It's pretty, it's not super great, but the most widely used method of execution in the U.S. today is lethal injection. And just kind of a fun fact is that the firing squad is actually the least painful, but it's still execution. It's still taking away someone's right to live. I really believe that there's no humane way to execute somebody. There is this quote that I really like from this article from the Center for Constitutional Rights, and it says, "The death penalty is a denial of the most human basic rights. It violates one of the most fundamental principles under widely accepted human rights laws, that states must recognize the right to live." Kind of again, I think there's no humane way to execute. It is taking away someone's basic right to live. It affects their life, obviously, forever, and it affects all their loved ones. I do kind of want to go back to what Will was talking about earlier about innocence. And if somebody's innocent is executed and then later found innocent, the execution cannot be undone. I feel like it's way more permanent than just being jailed or being punished in a different way. and there's no going back, just how I was saying, there's no undoing that. Also, I believe that killing somebody, executing somebody for their crime, does not undo their crime. Their crime is done, and just because you're going to kill them or, execute them, it still doesn't undo their crime. There's different ways to, punish somebody. In conclusion, I just want to say that the death penalty needs to be abolished in all 50 states because it does not deter crime effectively. It is incompatible with human rights. It risks the execution of innocent people, and there are just better, more constitutional ways to punish for crime. So, thank you.